So there are two different types of depletion. One is exponential and the other one is peaked. And an exponential depletion rate basically means that things will deplete faster and faster and faster and faster. But as many experts point out, it can't ever deplete entirely because eventually we stop mining it. We do what we call the peaked depletion rate. We stop mining and we find alternative sources, and so we don't fully deplete it. We approach it, but we don't fully deplete it. And so the peaked depletion rate is far more of a reflection of kind of what happens once we realize that we're coming close to depleting what we have. We try to find an alternative solution. And so this figure specifically looks at the rate of the depletion rate of resources. They were rising exponentially, and eventually, obviously, they would have eventually depleted at a particular point in time. But as you'll see on the next page, that's not how it often works. This is just theoretically how it could work. So here with the peaked depletion rate, we see it going up over a period of time, and then as the consumption of resources starts to slow down, there's no definitive depletion point. We start slowing down our use of it, and then ultimately we choose another resource because this resource becomes scarce, or becomes too expensive, or we find new technologies that enable us to use something else. And this figure just shows us the U.S. production of crude oil in terms of our use of it. Went up and up and up, peaked in the 70s, and then we started to have problems with the oil crisis. We couldn't get the oil from other oil-producing nations. Gas prices went up, all that sort of stuff in the 70s and into the 80s. And so our production of crude oil is certainly down. We are not a primarily oil-producing country. We, if we go to comparative advantage, it is not our comparative advantage to mine and produce crude oil. It is much better for us to get it from other countries where they can do it more, where it's more plentiful, and they are able to, that's what they can produce more efficiently, and then we trade off, other items instead. So that's part of the comparative advantage trade that Ricardo was talking about. And so, our use of our production of crude oil was on the rise, but it's still again stabilized. We've still had problems with gas prices and stuff, and we've never been energy independent. I don't think it'll ever be possible for us to be energy independent unless we choose to go fully solar, but we know that won't happen. Same here as we look at the production of natural gas, peaked in the 60s, went down, and it's back up again, and largely because of fracking, that it's enabled us to access natural gas in a way that we weren't able to do before. So this shift here has to do a lot with technology that enabled us to find different ways of extracting natural gas, as the traditional ways or conventional ways of accessing natural gas started to deplete what we could access under the current technologies, or the then current technologies. The most important takeaway in terms of the depletion of minerals is for us to remember that fossil fuels are a finite resource. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but there are some people that put great value on the fact that it is finite, so therefore we should not exhaust it now, to support future generations, versus others that are very much in the moment and it doesn't matter. We shouldn't care about what the future holds. We should care about what we have available to us now. Therein lies some of the ethical dilemmas, which we're going to dive into. So, what are the ethical considerations of pollution control? Some of the main reasons businesses were able to ignore environmental impact of practices is because no one owns air and water, so they're considered free goods. No one considered what the cost would be environmentally for just taking water as need be, polluting it as they want, and the air. So without some checks and balances there about ownership, it definitely resulted in people taking advantage and harming the environment. There's no protections that would be provided as they would be by a normal private owner. And they assumed that these resources would be an unlimited good, that there were no consequences for, polluting the water or using up water, in all its resources, as well as, polluting in the air. I don't know how you could not see that, but, one knows what people are thinking. And so where does consumer responsibility come into play here? Obviously, our goal is to think primarily about our use of automobiles. And I loved living in New York, where there was a wonderful public transportation system. People I know go, "Oh, the subway," but it's a really effective system, and it works really well. And it certainly minimizes the environmental impact of human beings. I mean, if you've ever tried to drive in New York City, right? Pollution is high. From people using cars, the traffic, the gridlock, it's pretty bad. So using public transportation, subways and things is so much better in that circumstance. If we could get our metro system to expand and actually to be safe, it could be a really wonderful system in St. Louis, but people really would much rather drive. So that also creates problems with air pollution. If you live in the country, you don't really have the same options for public transportation. I look at Europe when I traveled in Europe this past fall, and there were railway systems that were clean air, and they really had a wonderful positive impact on connectivity from people to people and place to place. And it had a nominal impact on the environment because it was electric, right? So these are things that we should consider. And getting away and moving away from automobiles and moving more towards public transportation, or at least cars that don't have such a negative impact on the environment. So using, if we can, using hybrids or electric cars where appropriate, and maximizing our use of those to save our impact. Then, of course, sewage is a big problem when it comes to water supply, and what we put in our toilets, beyond just normal waste, but not processing waste appropriately. So when sewage from manufacturing processes end up in the water supply, or we don't properly dispose of human waste or animal waste for that matter, it can pollute our water. So we can have an impact on these things. And then add in population explosions that put way more pressure on the planet and on the environment. It's definitely a major concern. So in terms of the ecological ethics of it all, anthropocentrism is the main obstacle to environmental concerns. And basically, it is this idea that we are in control of nature, and that nature is instrumental to us, that it doesn't matter what we do, we can do whatever we want to do, and it doesn't really matter. So when we get away from that attitude and we really focus on the interdependence of our relationship with nature as opposed to our dominance of and use of nature as just an instrument for our ends, that makes a big difference in how what we can do to help the environment. So the ecological systems view says humans are a part of a larger ecosystem. I belong to a Unitarian Universalist church, and one of our core values, one of our core principles is the interdependence of all living things. We recognize that the impact, if I engage in one thing, that has an impact on people, on nature, on the environment, on our planet, on our solar system. All of us are interdependent and interwoven, and the notion that we are rugged individualists as opposed to interdependent individuals is at the core of some of those questions, right? So many people believe I don't care about other people, I only care about me, and that level of selfishness is not going to help us survive because we start to harm each other, we start to hurt each other. Ecological ethics argue that based on the idea that the non-human parts of the environment deserve to be preserved simply for their own sake, right? So should we save national parks? Should we save that beauty for the sake of saving that beauty, not for worrying about whether or not it would benefit us other than giving us pleasure to go see it? Should we save it for its own sake? That's a harder argument to make for many people. I don't have a problem with it, but I can recognize that there are many people that would have a challenging perspective on that. It's like, why should I save it for its own sake? It's non-human. It doesn't have sentience. It doesn't have life. So, well, it has a different kind of life, but it doesn't have life the way that we define it in terms of being human. So, that could be a challenge. So there are a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about ecological ethics, like utilitarian and rights arguments are against industrialized farming and animal testing because it's about dignity and it's about moral rights and it's about greatest good for the greatest number of people and minimizing our negative impact and maximizing our value. So the utilitarian and rights arguments would be absolutely against all of those things in terms of making sure that they are cared for properly. The virtue ethics approach is more like the character of the individual and how we would do something to preserve it for its own sake. So I think virtue ethics would be very much in line with ecological ethics, where we think about the idea that we're going to save nature just because we should save it. It has value inherent in it, regardless of whether or not it's human. And so the virtue ethics is a way to get us to that place of recognizing we're going to do the altruistic thing. We're going to do the right thing, even if it may create some challenges for human beings. Obviously, the big debate is, should there be absolute bans on anything? And obviously there's pros and cons to this, but the notion of environmental rights and absolute bans really goes down to the right to be in a livable environment. And because we have that right to have a livable environment, it may require us to have an absolute ban on things. We've had to do absolute bans in past history where, in terms of nuclear waste and sort of how we process nuclear waste and other things. And so it may be that's what's ahead for us. Even if it might violate our individual rights, it's important to recognize that our individual rights are not as such that they should harm other people. When we think about the moral rights approach, it does value individual autonomy, but not to the extent where individual autonomy can hold somebody else down and harm somebody else. So we want to be very careful about how we think about that from the moral rights or universalist approach to things. William Blackstone said that the livable environment is a duty that we really have for others, that in order for us to fulfill our capacity in our life, to be free and rational beings, we need to have that livable environment. So moving on, markets and partial controls. If an absolute ban is not possible, is there any value in partial controls? So Blackstone's argument helps us to see things a little bit differently. For example, For example, it enables us to see the environmental problems as market defects. And so an environmental problem means the market is flawed. The market has a problem. Pollutants skew the real cost of producing products, which means that we think that we understand the full cost of things, but really when we start to take into account pollution, it increases the cost to produce. And if we were to just take the time to manage the resources appropriately and spend the money to manage the resources, that's a lower cost than it would be for us to clean up the pollutants and what it would cost our production in the long run. So there is value to us managing pollution in the short run versus the long run. So we don't want society to be harmed ultimately at the end of the day. So what are some of our 3 ethical deficiencies? Number 1 is that overproduction means more of society's resources are used, resources that could be used for other commodities. And so we want to be careful about how we use our resources. The other issue is that it ignores external costs. The cost of protecting environment, air pollution means that these costs are not minimized. So when we have to care for our environment, when we have to clean our air, we have to clean our rivers, there was a time that the Lake Erie and the rivers in Cleveland were on fire because of the level of pollutants that were in them. This is in my known history and time. So Ohio, Cleveland was a horrible, disgusting mess for years until they cleaned it up. And so there is a cost to clean it, but there's also a cost for not cleaning. And we pay a significantly higher cost in many ways when we don't take care of our environment. External costs introduce effective price differentials into markets. Struggling with saying words. Let me try that again. External costs will introduce effective price differentials into the marketplace. Once we realistically reflect the externalization, the costs, this is the issue. People don't pay the same price for the same commodities. Some people pay one price, some people pay another. If you live near a power plant, you pay not only the cost of power, but also the negative environmental impacts of living near the plant. So the externalization costs are not evenly meted out, and they need to be. If you live near a nuclear power plant, you always are living under the risk that that power plant will explode and it will create problems for you. Looking at or living in a chemical plant, looking at Bhopal, India, and the chemical plant that exploded there, and looking at the nuclear power plant in Russia or the Ukraine, I believe, that had that melted down and exploded, and it's still producing and it's still processing, and it will for generations. People that went in there knew they were going to die because they were being exposed to nuclear waste and nuclear heavy metals and radiation that was going to kill them. So the closer you live to these things, the more costly it is in other ways, that negative impact on the environment.